Hi there everyone, welcome back to On the Flip Side. My name is Adam Shawwalker, your host, and today we're going to be digging into the Nine Inch Nails back catalog for another worst to best. Nine Inch Nails is one of those bands that have just kind of permanently embedded themselves in the cultural zeitgeist. They are so permeated in modern culture that you don't always notice how much they've influenced modern music and culture in general. From their logo and music appearing in numerous shows, movies, and video games to being directly referenced and credited by countless other artists, Trent Reznor has had a nearly unmatched level of influence compared to many alternative artists. So Nine Inch Nails at its core is Trent Reznor, of course, with the addition of Atticus Ross in the past decade or so and a litany of other rotating, touring, and studio musicians. Trent has also been involved in many other side projects and film scores, but today we're going to be talking about the core Nine Inch Nails releases. We're not really going to be worrying about the remix Halos or Ghosts 1 through now 6, though some of those additional releases will hold a bit of a sway on my opinions of the main releases, kind of just based on the era. So let's get into it. I've got my list here, and in my opinion, the worst Nine Inch Nails record is Hesitation Marks. Now, I'm sure this won't be really shocking for a lot of people. This album came out at kind of an awkward time for a lot of late 90s iconic acts. Like, any band that had made it this far was only kind of just starting to really gain legendary or legacy status. And I mean, in the case of Reznor, he had definitely been massively influential for years already, but after a lot of steps away from the style that Nine Inch Nails had been embracing for the better part of a decade, Hesitation Marks, it comes out and it's a little bit quieter, it's very methodic to the point that the catchiness is focused in on and then eventually hammered out entirely in favor of like a very clean and technically impressive sound from a production angle, but lacking in many memorable tracks with a couple exceptions. It doesn't really help either that Trent decided to onboard Russell Mills again, the original visual artist for The Downward Spiral, or at least the album cover, further obfuscating the association between visuals and sound for this release. Like, I don't know if this was supposed to be a return to form gone terribly wrong. I mean, with the visuals, it's kind of hard to say. And to me, the callback in style visually just doesn't really justify itself, though I do really at least love the art that Mills provides here, even though I don't think it personally matches the album. It still is an excellent group of works. Anyway, the art side of things is to me a pretty minor part of this, but I thought it warranted a mention. I do think the biggest issue, of course, is the music, which really, for this band, at its worst, is kind of just mediocre. I mean, for a band of this caliber, this is a little bit rough. I don't think that there's any truly awful songs on this album, but there are definitely a few tracks that I like a lot more than some of the others, though most of the tracks here fall into a vague, kind of forgettable area, which definitely isn't great. I think the most solid tracks on Hesitation Marks are probably All Time Low, a loose, swinging track that feels a little bit more traditionally like a Nine Inch Nails song, more so than a lot of the other tracks here. I do like Satellite, which I find builds on some of their later 2000s era stuff. Copy of which has a really well done stripped back hook and a catchy chorus, and also the lead single from the album, Came Back Haunted, which I still listen to a decent amount even to this day. One of the biggest issues that I have with this album is that it's 80 minutes long and 14 tracks, and it really does not need to be. There's pretty much like 4 solid songs here, and the rest I had admittedly forgotten about until I sat down and re-listened to this album again for this video. And though I think this most recent listen has made me appreciate some of the subtleties more, it doesn't really end up redeeming the fact that this album is so obsessed with the little details that the bigger picture escapes it. Up next, we get a bit more recent with 2017's Add Violence. Now, I don't really have a ton to say about this release. This is the second of the trilogy of EPs or mini album releases that Nine Inch Nails did from 2016 to 2018. And yeah, it's 5 songs. The first track, Less Than, is in my opinion the best offering here. The Lovers is an okay track that I find fairly forgettable. Its follow-up, This Isn't the Place, I do love a decent amount, though. I think it feels kind of like a proper blend of Trent's soundtrack sensibilities and a little bit more of like the more cinematic Nine Inch Nails songs. songs. The next couple tracks, though, are pretty rough with Not Anymore, a fairly juvenile sounding punky track that doesn't really sound finished, and The Background World, which kind of starts interesting, but halfway through just kind of ends on a static that doesn't really build to anything. It just kind of ends, and the song really just fades out with like no kind of like impact. It's a very underwhelming song. I don't really hate this release. I do feel like this one was just a victim of rushed writing, or maybe some experiments that didn't really justify their inclusion, or maybe just needed a little bit more time in the oven. I like the aesthetic, I like some of the ideas, but this one, in my opinion, doesn't end up landing very well and kind of fumbles over itself. Up next is 2008's The Slip. Admittedly, of the entire Nine Inch Nails discography, this album I've probably listened to the least. It does have some pretty great moments on it, like Discipline, Lights in the Sky, or Letting You, all of which are pretty excellent tracks. I do also really appreciate that this was an album that was released for free as a follow-up to Ghosts 1 through 4. I do think it was a cool thing to do, especially because it was a move really ahead of its time. I mean, giving your album away for free in 2008, I mean, it's kind of a crazy thing to do, and it set a great precedent going forward of like really goodwill towards the fans. And that wasn't even like the first time Trent dabbled with that idea. Ghosts 1 through 4 was released the same way, and 2007's Year Zero was released with the album Stems, so if you wanted to remix like any of the tracks you wanted to, you could with all of the tools and the tracks you wanted. You could just send them off and have your remixes out there. It's really cool. Anyway, The Slip is an okay record. There's some minor consistency issues, but the way the album was rolled out, I think makes almost all of them completely forgivable. There's a lot of forgettable songs here, but even still, they all still try a lot, which I do respect. I think next up we're going with 2016's Not the Actual Events. This is the first album on this list where I do actually really like every track on the album. The one issue I've got with this record is the production choices. This album especially feels like the start of Trent Reznor's really weird, almost washed out production that kind of feels like an overcorrection after a squeaky clean sound like Hesitation Marks. In most cases it does still work, but I'm not the biggest fan of the sound, though in the moments where that sound isn't used so much, it does add a really nice bit of depth, so it's a bit of a give and take. I think my favorite tracks on this one are She's Gone Away and Burning Bright, Field on Fire, the latter very much so. And like on a list of tracks that paint an image in your head so vividly, Burning Bright is an absolutely fantastic song in that regard. I do also really love The Idea of You. The simplicity of the main riff really wins me over every time. It feels very similar to some of the stuff off of like Year Zero. And speaking of, I think my next choice on this list is 2007's Year Zero. I do think overall Year Zero is a pretty solid record. Like I said earlier, I really like what they did with the album's rollout, the way they made it incredibly easy to access this album's stems and provide a great resource for producers looking to do some remixes was really cool. And you can't mention Year Zero without mentioning the ever fascinating alternate reality game that the band put together to help promote the album on release, going as far as to load up the final participants in the ARG into a blacked out bus, driving them to an unknown location blindfolded and only unobscuring their vision once they were in a basement where Nine Inch Nails would perform a set of the new tracks off of the album, which would then be interrupted with a SWAT team shutting down the whole event. I just love the amount of effort that they put into that. And also a nice thing to mention is Year Zero Remixed, which are hand-picked remixes from the stems that they made public, which were then uploaded to the Nine Inch Nails website and eventually ended up on Year Zero Remixed. That whole remix album, along with the original Year Zero, I would almost even consider a better album than the original, but I really think the two of those albums together form a really great unit of work. As far as favorites for this album, I really love Survivalism, Vessel, Capital G has one of my favorite choruses on the album. The Great Destroyer is one of the most unique tracks in the Nine Inch Nails catalog for its absolutely massive synth and bass breakdown. Another version of The Truth, In This Twilight, and Zero Sum are also some of the best album closers that I've heard on any album. The rest of the tracks, while not as lasting in my opinion as the ones mentioned, are still great in their own right, and on Year Zero Remixed, any tracks that I wasn't as big of a fan of are made almost almost indispensable. Like the remixes for My Violent Heart, The Great Destroyer, The Beginning of the End. I mean, the remix for Meet Your Master is one of the best remixes on the whole damn thing, and once again, the final suite of Another Version of the Truth through Zero Sum is fantastic. Anyway, I do think this album as a whole would be higher on my list if you kind of took the remix album and maybe merged it with the original. Even still, both albums are in, their own right very good, and if you haven't listened to Year Zero Remixed, you should absolutely check it out as soon as possible. Next up, we're going with 2018's Bad Witch. I think Bad Witch really plays to the strength of both Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross. I think the whole experience is tight, the enjoyment over the runtime of the album is pretty constant. There are some fairly amazing experiments on this album that really pay off, like the various saxophone parts that are all over this album. I am also glad that they found a little bit more of a balance with that watery, washed out production. It is still used very heavily, and I kind of wish it still was maybe dialed back just a little bit more on this release, but it still works pretty well. I think my favorite tracks for this one are Play the Goddamn Part, Break Down the Door, and Over and Out, all of which really lean into a more melodic side of this album, even with the abrasiveness cranked to a pretty decent high the whole way through. Alright, I think next up we're going with 2005's With Teeth. I think this album was probably my first exposure to Nine Inch Nails. I was a kid when this album came out, but I definitely heard The Hand That Feeds at the ripe age of 7, though I don't think I would actually sit down and listen to a full Nine Inch Nails album until I found Pretty Hate Machine, but even still, this album has remained a very, very top favorite of mine. I do think this album suffers from a bit of a weak start, especially compared to like once the album gets underway. And I think that's a bit of a controversial take, but I do enjoy All the Love in the World and You Know What You Are and The Collector. I just think that after The Hand That Feeds, and including The Hand That Feeds, is really where the album starts to shine. So to me, this is a pretty middle and bottom heavy album with some of the best and most iconic songs in their whole discography. Among The Hand That Feeds, there is Every Day Is Exactly the Same, a song that still gives me waves of nostalgia. The title track, With Teeth, is fantastic. Only has one of the best drum tracks on the album, and Beside You in Time is hypnotic and beautiful. I also think Right Where It Belongs might be one of my favorite Nine Inch Nails tracks, though I personally prefer the alternate version 2 that was only available on the UK version for some reason. The original version is great, don't get me wrong, but the stripped back V2 is really haunting on the vocal side of things. You can really hear the grit and the passion in Trent's delivery. I do kind of hate that that version isn't very available outside of like YouTube. I really wish it was on Spotify because that would be ideal. So if you haven't listened to that version, I highly recommend checking it out after finishing up this video. Alright, we're starting to get a bit more into the thick of things. I think next I'm going with 1999's The Fragile. I do think that this album could even potentially be higher on the list. Some of their best material is on this album. In fact, despite some inconsistency issues due to the absolutely massive 100-minute runtime, this is still a very strong body of work. Even like the stuff that's a little bit lower on the rung is still like really good. I definitely feel like the stronger half of this album is the first disc, though disc 2 has some brilliant moments as well. And in the case of this disc, disc 1 is the left disc and disc 2 is the right disc, as that's how they chose to label them on this release. I do love the shift this album has from just a pure, absolutely self-loathing sound like on the Downward Spiral to a much more brooding, more contemplative rage. Tracks like Somewhat Damaged fall right in line with songs like La Mer or The Great Below. I love the juxtaposition of these beautiful, haunting melodies and the performances with some of the most aggressive work in this whole catalog. As for personal favorites though, I really love The Big Come Down, Into the Void, We're in This Together, The Day the World Went Away, The Fragile, Just Like You Imagined. I mean, this album is really just loaded with amazing moments. Trent really made this album sound as big as possible. It kind of goes from delicate and vulnerable to massive and uncompromising. I really love it. There is, a lot of people say that there's certain songs or albums that are a bit of a breath of fresh air, but this one is like, it builds these massive peaks and then it gives you a huge relieving sigh of relief. Alright, number 3 on our list is going to have to be their 1989 debut, Pretty Hate Machine. Pretty Hate Machine is one of those cornerstone albums for industrial that is just an absolutely titanic release. There are bands like Ministry or Skinny Puppy or KMFDM or whatnot that Trent Reznor obviously drew influence from that eventually led to this landmark album, but what Pretty Hate Machine did better than anything else before it was it brought industrial as a genre to the mainstream and made everything a lot more accessible. The pop sensibilities that Trent Reznor infused into this album are nothing short of the work of a master. Head Like a Hole is one of the catchiest tracks in the entire genre. Terrible Lie has a brilliant swinging chorus and hook down in it, incorporates an almost hip-hop style beat and flow for its lyrics. Something I Can Never Have is the first real glimpse that there's more going on behind the scenes in the writing department than just catchy industrial pop tracks with a raw, powerful, and emotive song with very intense staying power. The second half of the album doesn't let up either, with a swing back into groove with Kinda I Want To, shrieking, whirring hard dance synths assault the listener on Sin, and The Only Time hits a raw, sleazy edge. I don't think this album is perfect, but I do think it's close, and even though it's not perfect, it is still one of the most important albums in its genre. It may be, even in fact, more important than The Downward Spiral, just depending on who you ask. Alright. Number 2 on my list is 1992's Broken. I've talked about the Broken EP before on my channel. I think it's actually one of my more popular uploads, but anyway, I think this release is absolutely fascinating. The angsty, unfocused frustration on Pretty Hate Machine becomes honed to a ferocious beatdown of an experience. As far as industrial goes, I think that this is one of the most downright angry and violent releases in the whole genre. I mean, the pure vitriol front to back is impressive as an understatement. This is also a really important moment for the band because this EP wins the band their first Grammy with Wish, which won over Ministry, Megadeth, and Soundgarden, even Helmet. Anyway, this EP proper is the first 6 tracks. The songs Physical, though, and Suck were both leftover tracks from the past couple of years prior. If I remember right, I think Physical was a song they recorded for Lollapalooza, and I think Suck was a reworked Pigface track. So the main stretch of this release, Pinion through Gave Up, is an excellent stretch of songs that flow very cohesively. The 2 extra tracks still do fit quite well and are some of my favorite songs on the whole EP. Honestly, I don't really have much more to say about Broken that I haven't already said in previous videos or already here. I really love this release. I think Happiness and Slavery as a track might be one of my favorite Nine Inch Nails songs. Might even be my favorite. Alright, on to the final album. Number 1 on my list is probably not a surprise for most of you, but the best Nine Inch Nails album is hands down The Downward Spiral. There are so few albums like this. Utterly perfect albums, moment to moment, track to track, flawless. The 14 tracks on The Downward Spiral are almost above criticism to me. The album has only become more impactful with age. It is an absolute celebration of the human condition completely imploding in a violent and dramatic fashion. The crushing blows of the opener, Mr. Self-Destruct, still carry a full impact that hits harder with every listen. March of the Pigs, with its hammering beat and soft, sudden reprieves and chaotic sonic releases of sound, is a brilliantly heavy track and still catchy and is still incredibly dancey. Closer is the ultimate spooky bitch anthem. Drop this at any weird party and people will still go fucking nuts for it. Heresy and Ruiner still stand out to me as some of the most hate-filled songs on the album. The Becoming is as interesting as it is transformative for the sound on this album, flowing from intense industrial waves into I Do Not Want This, one of the most abrupt, disjointed experiences that acts as a shock to the system. A Warm Place into Eraser is a great pairing of tracks. I really like the way that Trent nails down his transitional elements on this album, really getting the flow of this project down to a science. It's done so well for this last section of the album. Reptile, for me, I think might be up there with Happiness and Slavery as another one of my absolute favorite Nine Inch Nails tracks. And man, the Downward Spiral into Hurt is so brutal for an album with so many crushing, heavy moments that wallows in self-loathing and lashing out as violently as possible. This album ends on a soft, beautiful, almost touching sweet with these 2 tracks. The Downward Spiral is truly a meditation on suicide, and while it isn't an endorsement or glamorization of it, it really, really presents the absolute lowest point in a fascinating lens. And Hurt, I don't think I really need to say much. It's perfect. It's utterly flattening. So like I said, there's few albums that I would really call perfect, but the Downward Spiral really is a masterpiece on every level. There's still a reason that people talk about this album even 30 years after its release. Anyway, that is my list of Nine Inch Nails from worst to best. There's plenty of stuff that I could have touched on, like Things Falling Apart, or Still, or the Quake soundtrack, or The Perfect Drug, or the numerous remixes and alternate versions of nearly every album. There's a lot of notable and worthwhile stuff here that I just did not talk about because it would be kind of redundant to touch on some of these. And while this is a worst to best video, I don't really think that there are any Nine Inch Nails releases that I would ever just call downright awful. All of them have some level of merit, and I think that they're all worth a listen. So if you haven't really delved into the Nine Inch Nails catalog, please consider doing so because it's really a treat. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of my list in the comments below, and tell me your lists. And also let me know what band I should cover next. And if you want to support the channel further, check out my Reverb store, my Instagram, and my Depop. Links to those are in the description below. Thank you all so much again, and we'll see you on the flip side.